contract arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1882, and Delilah Morrison knew before she even opened the envelope that her life was about to change in ways she could not control. Her father had been dead for 3 months, his gambling debt scattered across Denver like autumn leaves, and the creditors had come calling with voices that grew sharper each week. She stood in the kitchen of the small house she had grown up in, her mother's trembling hands passing her the letter that would seal her fate, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to become a commodity in a transaction that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. The letter was written in strong, slanting handwriting that suggested impatience, and it outlined terms that made her stomach twist. Xander Irons, a cattle rancher from Manassas, Colorado, needed a wife. He had heard through mutual acquaintances that the Morrison family was in dire straits, and he was prepared to clear all debts in exchange for marriage to their daughter. The proposal was blunt, almost brutal in its efficiency. There were no flowery words, no pretense of courtship. He would send money for travel expenses, and she would arrive in Manassas by the first week of October to be married immediately upon arrival. Delilah read the letter 3 times, each reading making her hands shake more violently than the last. Her mother wept quietly at the table, and her younger sister Emma watched with wide, frightened eyes from the doorway. They all knew there was no choice to be made here. The alternative was the street, destitution, or worse. At 22, Delilah had already weathered enough hardship to understand that life rarely offered mercy to women without means. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. "I will go," she said, and her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The journey from Denver to Manassas took 2 days by train and then wagon, the landscape transforming from the familiar streets of the city to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the San Luis Valley. Delilah watched through the train window as civilization seemed to thin and scatter, replaced by endless stretches of scrubland and distant mountains that looked like jagged teeth against the autumn sky. She had packed her few belongings into a single trunk, mostly practical dresses in dark colors and the few precious items that had belonged to her mother before poverty had forced them to sell almost everything of value. The wagon driver who collected her from the train station in Alamosa was a weathered man named Tom, who did not speak much beyond basic civility. He loaded her trunk with practiced efficiency and helped her onto the wagon seat with calloused hands that were surprisingly gentle. The ride to Manassas was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves on the dirt road. Delilah tried to prepare herself mentally for what awaited her, but how could one prepare to meet a stranger who would become a husband within hours? "Mr. Irons is a good man," Tom said suddenly, breaking the silence as they passed a cluster of modest buildings that marked the edge of Manassas. "Keeps to himself mostly, works hard, fair with his hands." Delilah turned to look at him, trying to read meaning into those sparse words. Fair with his hands could mean many things, and she was not sure which interpretation to hope for. She had heard stories of arranged marriages, of women who found themselves bound to cruel men, who saw wives as property to be used and discarded. The letter had been so cold, so transactional, that she had spent the entire journey imagining a man carved from stone, someone who would view her as nothing more than an obligation fulfilled. "Has he been married before?" she asked, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the wagon. Tom shook his head. "Never had the time for courting, I suppose. Ranch takes all his attention. Lost his parents young, had to build everything himself." The information did little to ease her anxiety, but at least it suggested he was not a widower with dark secrets or a man who had driven away previous wives. The wagon turned down a long dirt road that led away from the main cluster of buildings, and Delilah saw the ranch spread out before her. It was larger than she had expected, with a sturdy main house built from rough-hewn logs, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals where cattle grazed in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see a figure standing on the porch, waiting. Xander Irons was tall, she noticed that first. He stood with the kind of stillness that suggested a man comfortable in his own skin, his shoulders broad beneath a worn work shirt, his hat pulled low enough that she could not yet see his face clearly. As Tom brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house, Xander stepped down from the porch, and Delilah got her first clear look at the man she was about to marry. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 28 or 30, with a face that was weathered from sun and wind, but handsome in a rough, unpolished way. His jaw was strong, shadowed with stubble, and his eyes were a startling shade of gray that reminded her of storm clouds. There was something hard in his expression, a guardedness that made her think of walls built high and reinforced with years of solitude. He looked at her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Miss Morrison," he said, and his voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting orders across open land. "I trust the journey was not too difficult." "It was manageable, thank you," Delilah replied, accepting Tom's hand as he helped her down from the wagon. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, but she made herself stand straight, refusing to show weakness. Xander nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "The preacher is waiting inside. I thought it best to handle the formalities immediately, if that suits you." Of course he did. Why waste time on pleasantries when this was simply a business arrangement? Delilah swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth and nodded. "That suits me fine." Tom carried her trunk into the house, and Delilah followed Xander through the front door into a space that was surprisingly clean and well-maintained. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace, simple furniture that looked handmade but sturdy, and windows that let in good light. A small elderly man in black stood near the fireplace, holding a worn Bible, and he smiled kindly at Delilah as she entered. "This is Reverend Matthews," Xander said, gesturing toward the man. "He has agreed to perform the ceremony." The ceremony itself was brief, almost perfunctory. Delilah stood beside Xander, acutely aware of his height and the heat that seemed to radiate from his body. He did not touch her except when necessary, his hand engulfing hers as they exchanged simple vows that felt hollow in her mouth. She promised to honor and obey a man she did not know, and he promised to provide for her in that same flat, emotionless tone he had used since her arrival. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Xander did not kiss her. He simply nodded, released her hand, and turned to shake the Reverend's hand with thanks. Tom and Reverend Matthews left shortly after, and then Delilah was alone with her new husband in a house that smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. The silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy, until Xander finally cleared his throat. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I had one of the women from town come in to clean it and put fresh linens on the bed. You should find everything you need." Delilah blinked, confused. "My room?" "Yes." Xander's jaw tightened slightly. "I will not force myself on you, Miss Morrison." "Delilah," he corrected himself stiffly. "This marriage may be an arrangement, but I am not an animal. You will have your privacy." The words should have brought relief, and they did, but they also brought a strange, unexpected ache. It was clear he found no pleasure in this situation either, that she was as much a burden to him as he was a solution to her family's problems. She felt suddenly very small and very alone in this unfamiliar house with this stranger who was now legally bound to her. "Thank you," she managed to say, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Xander nodded again, that same sharp, economical movement. "I rise early for work. Breakfast is at dawn. You are welcome to explore the house and the immediate grounds, but do not wander far without telling me. The land can be dangerous if you do not know it." He turned and walked toward what she assumed was his own room, leaving her standing alone in the main room, with her trunk at her feet and a wedding band on her finger that felt like a shackle. Delilah took a shaky breath and picked up her trunk, carrying it carefully up the narrow stairs to the room he had indicated. The room was small but clean, with a single window that looked out over the ranch lands and a bed that had indeed been made up with fresh linens. There was a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small dresser, and a chair in the corner. It was sparse but functional, and Delilah set her trunk down and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. She had expected many things from this marriage. She had braced herself for demands, for a husband who would claim his marital rights immediately and without concern for her comfort. She had not expected to be given her own room, to be promised privacy and safety. The coldness of the arrangement stung, but the unexpected consideration confused her even more. What kind of man was Xander Irons? The letter had been so hard, so impersonal, and yet his actions suggested something more complex than simple cruelty. That first night, Delilah barely slept. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the creak of wood, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind that swept across the valley with relentless persistence. She thought of her mother and Emma, safe now from creditors because of the money Xander had paid. She thought of her father, whose weakness had led to this moment, and she thought of the man sleeping somewhere else in this house, a stranger who was now her husband, whose expression had been so guarded she could not begin to guess what he truly felt about any of this. Morning came cold and gray, and Delilah rose before dawn to find the kitchen already warm, the stove lit, and coffee brewing. Xander was nowhere to be seen, but she could hear movement from the barn outside. She found flour and eggs and set about making breakfast, falling back on the skills her mother had taught her. By the time Xander came in from the morning chores, she had biscuits baking and bacon sizzling in a pan. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face before he schooled it back to neutrality. "You did not have to do that." "I am your wife," Delilah said, keeping her tone even. "I intend to earn my place here." Something shifted in his expression, too quick for her to catch and name. He removed his hat and hung it by the door, then washed his hands at the basin before sitting down at the table. Delilah served him and then sat across from him, and they ate in silence that felt slightly less hostile than the previous day. Over the following weeks, a strange pattern emerged. Xander was gone most of the day, working the ranch with a small crew of hands who came and went. Delilah kept the house, cooked meals, and slowly began to explore the property as her confidence grew. They spoke little, their conversations limited to practical matters and brief exchanges at meals. Yet, Delilah began to notice things about her husband that did not fit with her initial impression. He was meticulous about certain things. He always removed his boots before entering the house, always washed before sitting down to eat. He brought in firewood without being asked, and fixed a broken hinge on her bedroom door the same day she mentioned it was sticking. Once she looked out the window to see him carefully relocating a bird's nest that had been built in an inconvenient location, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he secured it in a nearby tree. These small observations accumulated like snowflakes, each one individually insignificant, but together building into something that shifted her understanding. The coldness she had perceived in his letter and his initial demeanor was not cruelty, she began to realize. It was protection. He was a man who had learned to guard himself, to keep the world at arm's length, and the marriage had been as much a leap into the unknown for him as it had been for her. One evening in late October, a storm rolled across the valley with sudden violence. Delilah was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the first drops began to fall, quickly escalating into a downpour that hammered against the windows and roof. She heard shouting from outside and looked out to see Xander and his men struggling to get the cattle into shelter. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder, so loud it rattled the dishes on the shelves. Delilah stood at the window, watching with growing anxiety as the men worked in the storm. She saw one of the horses rear in panic, saw Xander grab the reins and fight to control the animal. Her heart was suddenly in her throat, and she realized with startling clarity that she did not want to see him hurt. The realization was unexpected, unsettling. When had she started to care? By the time Xander came back to the house, he was soaked through, his clothes clinging to his body and water dripping from his hat. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue, and for the first time since she had arrived, his guard was down. Delilah moved without thinking, grabbing towels from the cupboard and thrusting them at him. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, because worry made her angry. Xander looked at her with surprise, taking the towels automatically. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are soaked and shivering. Go change, and I will heat up dinner." For a moment she thought he might argue, but then he simply nodded and went upstairs. When he came back down in dry clothes, his hair still damp, Delilah had hot stew and fresh bread waiting. She poured him coffee and watched as he ate, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as warmth and food restored him. "Thank you," he said quietly, and there was something different in his voice, a softness she had not heard before. "You are welcome," Delilah replied, and for the first time since arriving in Manasseh, she felt like they were actually communicating, rather than simply exchanging necessary information. After that night, something shifted between them. The conversations grew longer, less stilted. Xander began to tell her about the ranch, explaining the work and the challenges he faced. Delilah shared stories about her life in Denver, carefully edited versions that avoided the worst of her father's decline. They still maintained separate rooms, still treated each other with a careful formality, but the walls were beginning to crack. November brought colder weather and the first real snow. Delilah woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white that made the landscape look softer, less harsh. She came downstairs to find Xander already up, but instead of heading out immediately to work, he was standing at the window, looking out at the snow with an expression that was almost peaceful. "It is beautiful," Delilah said softly, coming to stand beside him. "It is," Xander agreed, "but it makes the work harder. The cattle need more attention in winter. Is there anything I can do to help?" He turned to look at her, that storm-gray gaze searching her face. "You do help. Having hot meals and a warm house to come back to makes more difference than you might think." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Delilah felt her cheeks warm, and she looked back out at the snow to hide her reaction. "I am glad to be useful. You are more than useful," Xander said, and there was an intensity in his voice that made her heart skip. "You have made this house feel like a home." Before she could respond, he was pulling on his coat and heading out to face the day's work, leaving her standing at the window with her thoughts in turmoil. The admission had been small, but it felt significant, like a door opening just a crack to reveal light beyond. As winter deepened, Delilah found herself watching for Xander's return each evening with growing anticipation. She began to notice details about him that made her pulse quicken. The way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was amused, even though he rarely smiled fully. The strength in his hands as he worked, capable of both power and surprising gentleness. The rare moments when he forgot to guard his expression and she could see loneliness there, a mirror of her own. One particularly cold evening in early December, Delilah was mending a shirt by the fire when Xander came in from his final check of the animals. He looked frozen, his movements stiff as he removed his coat and hat. Without thinking, Delilah set aside her mending and went to pour him coffee, adding a generous measure of the whiskey she had found in the cupboard for medicinal purposes. "Drink this," she said, handing him the cup. "It will help with the cold." Xander took it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Thank you. It is brutal out there tonight." Delilah returned to her chair, but found herself unable to focus on her mending. Instead, she watched Xander as he sat by the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. There was something she needed to understand, a question that had been building in her mind for weeks. "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" she asked suddenly. "You could have hired a housekeeper if you needed someone to cook and clean. Why take on the responsibility of a wife?" Xander was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "I was tired of being alone. I built this ranch with my own hands after my parents died. I worked until my body screamed for rest, and I told myself it was enough. But a ranch is not a life. Coming back to an empty house every night, eating alone, sleeping alone, it wears on a man. I thought perhaps a practical arrangement would be easier than trying to court someone, easier than risking rejection." The honesty in his words struck her deeply. "You thought I would reject you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look at me, Delilah. I am a rancher with rough hands and rougher manners. I do not know how to dance or recite poetry. What would I have to offer a woman beyond hard work in a harsh land?" Delilah set down her mending and moved to sit in the chair closer to him, her heart pounding. "You have offered me safety when I had none. You have been patient and kind when you could have been cruel. You gave me my own room and my own space when most men would have demanded their marital rights without question. Those are not small things, Xander." He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression made her breath catch. "I wanted you to come to me willingly, if you ever came at all. I did not want to force anything." "What if I told you," Delilah said carefully, her voice trembling slightly, "that I no longer need my own room?" The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Xander's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for uncertainty. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel obligated." "I am certain," Delilah said, and she realized with startling clarity that she was. Somewhere in the past 2 months, this stranger had become familiar. The arrangement had become something more. She had fallen for the man who relocated bird nests and heated her bathwater without being asked, who worked himself to exhaustion to build something lasting, who looked at her like she was precious, even when he thought she was not paying attention. Xander reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one rough palm. His touch was gentle, reverent, and Delilah leaned into it, closing her eyes. When he kissed her, it was soft and tentative, a question rather than a demand. She answered by pressing closer, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, where she could feel his heart pounding as hard as her own. They took their time that night, learning each other with patience and care. Xander was true to his word, never pushing, always watching her for signs of discomfort or fear. But there was no fear, only a growing warmth that had nothing to do with the fire still burning in the hearth. When they finally made their way upstairs, it was to his room, and Delilah knew with certainty that she would not be returning to her own. The winter months that followed were a revelation. The physical intimacy broke down the last remaining walls between them, and Delilah discovered depths to her husband that she had only glimpsed before. He was passionate beneath the controlled exterior, and he was surprisingly playful when he allowed himself to relax. He teased her gently while they worked together in the kitchen, and she learned to give as good as she got, their banter becoming a comfortable rhythm. They talked for hours in bed, sharing stories and dreams in the darkness. Xander told her about his childhood, about losing his parents to influenza when he was barely 19 and having to figure out how to run the ranch alone. He spoke of the isolation and the struggle, of the years of loneliness that had hardened him. Delilah shared her own pain, the shame of her father's gambling, the terror of watching her family sink into poverty, the helplessness of being a woman with few options. "I was so angry when that letter came," she admitted one night, lying with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I felt like I was being sold." "You were," Xander said bluntly. "And I am sorry for my part in that. If I could go back, I would court you properly. I would bring you flowers and take you to dances. I would try to win your heart before asking for your hand." Delilah lifted her head to look at him. "But then I might not have come. I might have been too proud to accept help from a stranger. Perhaps this was the only way we would have found each other." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Perhaps. But I still wish I had given you a choice." "You did," Delilah said firmly. "Every day since I arrived, you have given me choices. You gave me space when I needed it, and you let me come to you when I was ready. That is more than many women in arranged marriages can say." As the new year turned to 1883, life on the ranch settled into a comfortable pattern. The work was hard, but Delilah found she did not mind. She helped where she could, learning to care for the chickens and the vegetable garden that would be planted in spring. She got to know the ranch hands, particularly Tom, who had warmed up to her considerably and often shared gossip from town. One of the hands, a young man named Jesse, had a sweetheart in Manasseh, and Delilah found herself helping him compose letters to the girl. It amused Xander greatly to watch his tough cow hands stumble over romantic phrases, and one evening he confessed that he was grateful he had never had to attempt such things himself. "You never wrote love letters?" Delilah asked, surprised. "Never had anyone to write them to," Xander replied. "And I would have been terrible at it. What would I say? 'Dear lady, my cattle are fat and my fences are strong'?" Delilah burst out laughing, the sound ringing through the house. "That is absolutely terrible. It is a good thing you went with the practical approach." "Is it?" Xander asked, pulling her onto his lap. "Because I think I might have missed out on something important. Perhaps I should try my hand at romance now." "Oh? And how would you do that?" He pretended to think hard. "Delilah, your biscuits are the finest in the valley, and your coffee is strong enough to wake the dead. Will you do me the honor of remaining my wife?" She swatted his shoulder, still laughing. "You are impossible." "But you love me anyway," he said, and the teasing note in his voice could not quite hide the vulnerability beneath. Delilah sobered, cupping his face in her hands. "I do. I love you more than I thought possible. You surprised me, Xander Irons." "You surprised me too," he said softly. "I expected a transaction, and I got a partner. I expected duty, and I got devotion. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Delilah." They kissed then, slow and deep, and Delilah marveled at how far they had come from that cold, awkward wedding day. The arrangement had become a real marriage, and the stranger had become her heart. Spring came late to the San Luis Valley, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the land. Green spread across the brown earth, wildflowers bloomed in unexpected places, and the world felt full of possibility. Delilah spent hours working in the garden, coaxing vegetables from the soil with the same patience she had used to coax her husband from his protective shell. One afternoon in late April, she was kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds, when she felt eyes on her. She looked up to find Xander leaning against the fence, watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Should you be working so hard?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes concerned. Delilah sat back on her heels, confused. "Why would I not?" Xander pushed off from the fence and came to crouch beside her. "I just thought, with the baby coming, you might want to take things easier." Delilah froze, her hands stilling in the dirt. "What baby?" Now it was Xander's turn to look confused. "You have not been feeling well in the mornings. You fell asleep right after dinner last night, and your dresses are getting tighter. I just assumed you knew and were waiting to tell me." Delilah's mind raced, pieces clicking into place. The nausea that had plagued her for the past 2 weeks, the exhaustion that seemed to settle into her bones, the way her body felt different in ways she had attributed to other causes. "Oh," she breathed, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "Oh, you did not know," Xander said, and there was wonder in his voice now. "Delilah, we are going to have a baby." The news took time to settle, but when it did, it brought joy that Delilah had not anticipated. She had not thought beyond the day-to-day reality of her new life, had not allowed herself to imagine a future that included children, but now the possibility was real and immediate, and she found herself eager for it. Xander became even more protective than before, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and fussing over her in ways that would have been annoying if they had not been so endearing. She finally had to put her foot down one evening when he tried to carry her upstairs because he thought the steps might be too taxing. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said firmly. "I can walk upstairs, Xander." "I know, but what if you get dizzy? What if you fall? Then I will call for you. But you cannot hover over me for the next 6 months. You have a ranch to run." He looked so torn that she softened, reaching up to kiss him. "I promise I will be careful, but you have to trust me to know my own limits." "I do trust you," he said. "I just want you both to be safe." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Delilah's body changed in ways that fascinated and occasionally frustrated her, but Xander seemed to find her even more beautiful as she grew rounder. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making promises about the life they would build together. "I am going to teach you to ride," he would say, his hand spread across her stomach, "and how to mend fences and care for the cattle, but your mother will teach you the important things, like how to make a house a home." "What if it is a girl?" Delilah asked one night. "Will you still teach her to ride and mend fences?" "Especially if it is a girl," Xander said firmly. "This land does not care about gender. Everyone who lives here needs to know how to survive." Delilah smiled in the darkness, loving him even more for that attitude. She had worried briefly that he might want a son above all else, but he seemed genuinely unconcerned about the baby's gender, interested only in the child's health and arrival. In early November, as the weather turned cold again and snow began to dust the ground, Delilah went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that terrified Xander far more than it did her. The doctor from Manassas came to help, along with a midwife named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the valley. They shooed Xander out of the bedroom repeatedly as he tried to hover, sending him downstairs to pace and worry. When the baby finally arrived in the early hours of the morning, it was a boy with a strong set of lungs and his father's gray eyes. Xander was allowed back into the room, and Delilah would never forget the expression on his face when he first held his son. All the hardness melted away, leaving only wonder and love and a vulnerability that made tears prick her eyes. "He is perfect," Xander whispered, staring down at the tiny face. "You are perfect. Thank you, Delilah." "We made him together," Delilah said, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but never settled on one definitively. Now, looking at their son, Xander said, "What about Michael, after your father?" Delilah was surprised. Her father's name had rarely been spoken between them, the shame of his debt still raw. "Are you certain?" "Whatever his flaws, he gave you life," Xander said, "and you gave me everything. It seems right to honor that." So, Michael he became, Michael Irons, and he fit into their lives as if he had always been meant to be there. The early months were exhausting. punctuated by sleepless nights and constant feedings. But Delilah had never felt more content. Xander proved to be a devoted father, pacing the floors with Michael when he cried and changing diapers without complaint. The ranch hands fell over themselves, trying to catch glimpses of the baby, and even gruff old Tom turned soft when Michael grabbed his finger with tiny, determined hands. As winter gave way to spring again, and Michael grew from a tiny infant into a robust baby who laughed and reached for everything within grasp, Delilah often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The contract that had felt like a prison sentence had become the foundation of the greatest happiness she had ever known. The hard man she had feared had turned out to have the gentlest heart she could have imagined. One evening in late May, with Michael asleep in his cradle and the windows open to let in the spring breeze, Delilah and Xander sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Xander held her hand, his thumb tracing idle patterns on her skin, and the silence between them was comfortable and full. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked suddenly. "Agreeing to marry me?" Delilah turned to look at him, seeing the lingering insecurity that probably would never fully leave him. "Never. Not once. Do you?" "God, no," he said fervently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I just worry sometimes that you gave up too much, that you deserve better than a desperate arrangement." "I deserved exactly what I got," Delilah said firmly. "A man who treats me with respect and kindness, a partner who shares his life with me, a father who loves his son with his whole heart. You gave me all of that, Xander. How could I possibly want more?" He pulled her closer, kissing her temple. "I want to give you the world." "You already have," she said simply. "This ranch, this life, our son, you. That is my whole world, and it is everything I need." As the seasons continued to turn, life on the ranch developed its own rhythm. Michael grew into a curious, energetic toddler who followed his father around whenever possible, trying to imitate everything Xander did. Delilah's mother and sister came to visit in the summer of 1884, and seeing them comfortable and happy, free from the stress of debt, made Delilah grateful all over again for the choice she had made. Emma, now 16, was wide-eyed at the ranch, and Delilah noticed with amusement that Jessie, the young ranch hand, seemed equally fascinated by her sister. She said nothing, but she smiled when she caught them talking by the barn, Emma laughing at something Jessie said. Perhaps another arrangement would not be necessary. Perhaps some things could happen naturally. Her mother pulled her aside one afternoon, studying her face carefully. "You are happy," she said, and it was not a question. "I am," Delilah confirmed. "More than I ever thought I could be." "I worried," her mother admitted. "When you agreed to marry a stranger, I worried that I had failed you as a mother, that I should have found another way." "There was no other way," Delilah said gently. "And you did not fail me. You taught me to be strong, to be practical, to survive. Those lessons served me well. But I got lucky too. Xander could have been cruel, and he was not. He could have been cold, and he turned out to have the warmest heart I have ever known." Her mother hugged her tightly. "I am glad. You deserve happiness, my darling girl." After her family left, Delilah found herself thinking about luck and fate and the strange paths that life could take. She had come to Manasseh expecting nothing but hardship, and she had found love instead. The realization made her grateful for every difficult moment that had led her here, every choice that had seemed impossible at the time. In the fall of 1884, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with joy rather than surprise, and Michael, now almost 2 years old, seemed excited about the prospect of a sibling, even if he did not fully understand what it meant. The pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Delilah knew what to expect, and when their daughter was born in April of 1885, it felt like the family was complete. They named her Sarah, after Xander's mother, and she was a calm, peaceful baby who seemed content to observe the world with serious, dark eyes. Michael was fascinated by her, constantly wanting to hold her and help care for her. Xander joked that they would need to build an addition to the house if they kept going, and Delilah laughingly agreed. But more than the physical space, what struck Delilah was how full the house felt now. The silence and emptiness that had characterized those early days were gone, replaced by noise and life and love. Michael's laughter, Sarah's cries, the constant coming and going of ranch hands, the sound of Xander's voice singing softly to their daughter while he rocked her to sleep. These were the sounds of home. One particularly memorable evening in June, when Michael was 3 and Sarah was 2 months old, there was a summer storm that swept across the valley. It was not as violent as that first storm Delilah had witnessed, but it was dramatic, with lightning illuminating the sky and thunder rolling across the land. Michael was frightened, clinging to Delilah, and Xander scooped him up, carrying him to the window. "Look," Xander said, pointing at the lightning. "Do you see that? That is nature showing off. It is beautiful and powerful, just like this land. You do not need to be afraid of it. You just need to respect it." Michael watched with wide eyes as his father explained storms and rain and the cycle of weather that made the ranch possible. Delilah watched them both, Sarah cradled in her arms, and felt her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. This was her family, these were her people, and she would not trade them for anything. As the years passed, the ranch prospered. Xander's hard work and careful management paid off, and they were able to expand, buying adjacent land and increasing the herd. The house was expanded too, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Delilah had become known in Manasseh as an excellent cook, and she often hosted gatherings for the community, opening their home with the same generosity that Xander showed to anyone who needed help. Michael grew into a serious, thoughtful child who loved the ranch and showed early signs of having his father's work ethic. Sarah was quieter but fiercely independent, and she followed her brother everywhere, determined to keep up despite being younger and smaller. Delilah often found them in the barn, helping with chores in ways that usually created more work but filled her with joy nonetheless. Emma visited regularly, and as Delilah had suspected, her relationship with Jesse developed into something serious. When Jesse asked Xander's permission to propose, Xander gave it gladly, and the wedding was held at the ranch in the summer of 1887. It was a beautiful celebration, full of love and laughter, and Delilah was thrilled to have her sister settling nearby. In the quiet moments, usually late at night when the children were asleep and the ranch was still, Delilah and Xander would talk about their life together. They marveled at how far they had come from that awkward first meeting, from the stiff formality of their early interactions to the easy intimacy they now shared. "I never thanked you properly," Xander said one night, pulling her close against his side. "For what?" Delilah asked, drowsy and content. "For taking a chance on me, for seeing past the rough exterior to whatever was underneath, for making me into someone worth loving." Delilah propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "You were always worth loving, Xander. I just had to discover it. And you made it easy." "I was terrified," he admitted. "When you arrived, I was terrified that you would hate me, that you would be miserable, that I had made a terrible mistake. And instead, you were brave and kind and patient. You gave me time to figure out how to be a husband. You never demanded more than I could give, but you also never settled for less than I was capable of. You challenged me to be better." "We challenged each other," Delilah corrected. "You taught me what it means to be a partner, to work together towards something bigger than ourselves. You gave me a purpose beyond mere survival." "I gave you a purpose?" Xander laughed softly. "Delilah, you are the purpose, you and the children. Everything I do is for you." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally drew apart, she whispered, "I love you. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," he replied, more than words can say. As 1888 rolled around and Michael turned 5, preparations began for him to start school in the fall. Delilah was both excited and nervous about this milestone, worried about how her serious, ranch-loving boy would adapt to the structure of a classroom. But Michael surprised her by taking to learning with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He came home each day full of stories about his teacher and the other children, and he proudly showed off his ability to write his name and read simple words. Sarah, now 3, missed her brother terribly during school hours and began demanding her own lessons from Delilah. Together, they worked on letters and numbers, and Sarah's fierce determination to keep up with Michael made teaching her a joy. Watching her children learn and grow, seeing them develop their own personalities and interests, filled Delilah with pride and wonder. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in the valley. Xander's reputation for fairness and hard work meant he had no trouble hiring good hands, and he began to mentor younger ranchers, sharing his knowledge generously. He was respected in the community, often called upon to mediate disputes or offer advice, and Delilah loved watching him grow into this role of informal leadership. But despite the outward success, what mattered most to both of them was the life they had built within the walls of their home. The evenings spent around the dinner table, sharing stories about the day. The weekends when they would pack a lunch and take the children on rides across the ranch, showing them the land that would one day be theirs. The quiet moments after the children were asleep, when they would sit by the fire and simply be together, needing no words to communicate their contentment. One evening in October of 1889, Delilah was putting Sarah to bed when her daughter asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mama, did you always love Papa?" Delilah sat down on the edge of the bed, smoothing Sarah's dark hair back from her forehead. "That is a complicated question, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" Mary at school said her mama and Papa loved each other from the first time they met, like a fairy tale. Was it like that for you and Papa? Delilah considered her answer carefully. No, it was not quite like a fairy tale. When I first met your Papa, I did not know him at all. We were strangers, but I learned to love him by watching how he treated people, by seeing how hard he worked, by discovering how kind and gentle he could be. Sometimes love is not instant. Sometimes it grows slowly, like a seed planted in good soil. And that kind of love can be just as strong, if not stronger, than love at first sight. Sarah thought about this, her small face serious. "So, you did not love Papa right away?" "I did not know him well enough to love him right away," Delilah said, "but I learned to love him, and now I cannot imagine my life without him. He is my best friend, Sarah, and that is the greatest gift of all." "I think that is better than a fairy tale," Sarah decided, "because it is real." Delilah kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart full. "Yes, sweetheart, it is very real." When she shared the conversation with Xander later that night, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you think the children will understand someday how we came to be married? About the arrangement?" "I think we will tell them when they are old enough to understand," Delilah said. "And we will explain that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places, that what starts as necessity can become love, that their father is the best man I have ever known, and I am grateful every day that circumstances brought us together." "Even though you had no choice?" Xander asked, and she could hear the old insecurity creeping back into his voice. "I had a choice," Delilah said firmly. "Maybe not in coming here, but in everything after. I chose to give us a chance. I chose to see the man you really were beneath the guardedness. I chose to love you, Xander, and I would choose you again every single day." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life being grateful." "You deserve everything good," Delilah whispered. "You always have." As the children grew older and more independent, Delilah found time to pursue her own interests. She became deeply involved in the community, helping to organize social events and working to establish a lending library in Manassas. She also began teaching children whose families lived too far from town to attend school regularly, holding classes twice a week at the ranch. Xander supported all of her endeavors, proud of how she had become a pillar of the community. He joked that she was more popular than he was, and she would laugh and remind him that she had learned everything about building relationships from watching him work with his ranch hands and neighbors. In 1892, when Michael was 9 and Sarah was 7, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. The news was both exciting and slightly daunting, as she had assumed their family was complete. But when their second son was born in early 1893, he brought with him such joy that any reservations melted away. They named him Thomas after Tom, who had become not just an employee but a true friend over the years. Tom was deeply touched by the honor, and he appointed himself the baby's unofficial guardian, watching over Thomas with the same devotion he showed to the ranch. Michael and Sarah adored their new brother, competing to hold him and help with his care. The house was full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Delilah would not have changed a thing. She watched her children interact, seeing how they learned from each other, how they supported and challenged each other, and she felt blessed beyond measure. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Michael grew tall and strong, clearly destined to inherit his father's build and work ethic. Sarah remained fierce and independent, excelling in her studies and showing a talent for working with horses that rivaled her father's. Thomas was a happy, easygoing child who seemed to find joy in everything and who had inherited his mother's gift for bringing people together. When Michael turned 15 in 1898, he began working on the ranch full-time during summers, learning the business from the ground up. Xander was a patient teacher, explaining not just the how, but the why of every decision, preparing his son to eventually take over. Watching them work together, seeing the mutual respect and love between father and son, made Delilah's heart swell with pride. Sarah, now 12, was beginning to show interest in education beyond what Manasseh could offer, and Delilah and Xander had long discussions about the possibility of sending her to a girls' academy in Denver. It was a difficult decision, balancing her desire to learn with their wish to keep her close, but ultimately they decided to support her dreams, whatever they might be. Thomas, at 5, was simply content to be wherever his family was, his cheerful presence a constant source of light in their lives. One evening in the summer of 1899, Delilah and Xander took a rare moment for themselves, riding out to a favorite spot on the ranch where they could watch the sunset. They sat in comfortable silence, Xander's arm around her shoulders as the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple. 17 years, Xander said softly. Can you believe it has been 17 years since you arrived in Manasseh? It feels both longer and shorter than that, Delilah replied. So much has happened. We have built so much together. Do you remember how terrified I was that first day? Xander asked. I kept thinking you would take one look at me and run. Delilah laughed. I was too terrified myself to think about running, but I remember thinking that you looked hard, unapproachable. I never could have guessed then what you would become to me. And what is that? Xander asked, though the smile in his voice suggested he knew the answer. Everything, Delilah said simply. My partner, my love, my home. You are everything, Xander. He turned to kiss her, slow and sweet, and when they drew apart, there were tears in his eyes. I never imagined I could be this happy, this content. You gave me a family, Delilah. You gave me a reason to build something beyond simple survival. You taught me that life can be beautiful. We taught each other, Delilah said. That is what partnership means, growing together, learning together, and we are not done yet. We still have so many years ahead of us. And I want to spend every one of them with you, Xander said. Growing old together, watching our children build their own lives, maybe someday meeting grandchildren, all of it, every moment, with you by my side. That is all I want too, Delilah whispered, all I will ever want. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, Delilah reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had arrived in Manasseh all those years ago felt like a different person, someone she barely recognized. She had been so certain her life was ending, that the arranged marriage was a sentence to be endured. Instead, it had been a beginning. The hard man of that initial letter had revealed himself to be gentle in all the ways that mattered. The stranger had become her soulmate. The arrangement had become the greatest love story of her life. Years continued to unfold with their own rhythms and challenges. Michael married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch in 1903, and the wedding was a grand affair that drew people from all over the valley. Delilah cried happy tears as she watched her firstborn pledge his life to another, seeing echoes of her own wedding day in the ceremony, but noting the stark differences too. Michael and his bride, Catherine, had the gift of time and courtship, of knowing each other before making such a serious commitment. But as Delilah held Xander's hand during the ceremony, she found she did not regret the path she and her husband had taken. Their love had been hard-won, earned through patience and trust, and that made it all the more precious. Sarah did eventually attend school in Denver, excelling in her studies and returning home during breaks full of stories and ideas. She talked about becoming a teacher herself, wanting to help other children discover the joy of learning. Xander worried about her being so far away, but he supported her dreams just as he had always supported Delilah's. Thomas grew into a charming, sociable young man who seemed to know everyone in the valley. He did not have Michael's single-minded focus on ranching, but he had a gift for business and numbers that proved invaluable in managing the ranch's finances and sales. Grandchildren began to arrive in due course. Michael and Catherine had a daughter first, then twin sons, and the ranch house echoed with young voices once again. Delilah loved being a grandmother, spoiling the little ones in ways she had been too busy to spoil her own children. Xander, now graying at the temples but still strong and capable, was a doting grandfather who could often be found with a child on his shoulders or reading stories by the fire. One evening, as they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1912, surrounded by family and friends, Delilah looked around the room and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. The house was full to bursting, with 3 generations gathered to celebrate. There was music and laughter, food and drink, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the life she and Xander had built together. Michael stood with his wife and children, already showing signs of the strong leader he would become when he eventually took over the ranch. Sarah was home from Denver, where she now taught at a girls' school, and she was deep in conversation with some of the younger women about education and opportunities. Thomas was charming everyone, as always, making sure drinks were filled and everyone felt welcome. And at the center of it all was Xander, her husband of 30 years, who caught her eye across the room and smiled. It was the same smile that had taken her breath away years ago when she first realized she was falling in love with him. A smile that was just for her, full of love and promise and shared history. Later, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in their customary spots, watching the stars emerge in the night sky. Xander held her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her skin. 30 years, he said softly. I should have prepared a speech. I do not need speeches, Delilah said. I have everything I need right here. Do you ever think about what your life might have been like if things had been different? Xander asked. If your father had not had debts, if you had never received that letter? Sometimes, Delilah admitted. But I cannot imagine it leading anywhere better than this. Maybe I would have married someone else, lived a different life. But would I have been this happy? Would I have built something this beautiful? I do not think so. I think about it too, Xander said. I think about how close I came to never meeting you. If I had waited another year to seek a wife, if I had chosen someone else, if you had refused to come, so many small moments that could have changed everything. But they did not, Delilah said firmly. We found each other, Xander. Against all odds, we found each other, and we built this together. The best decision I ever made, Xander said, was writing that letter. The second best decision was opening my heart when you arrived, instead of keeping you at a distance. You gave me time, Delilah said. You gave me space and patience and gentleness when you could have demanded submission. That was the greatest gift you ever gave me, Xander, the freedom to choose you. And you chose me every day since, Xander said, his voice rough with emotion. That is the miracle I still cannot quite believe. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the house, a baby cried softly and then settled. A coyote called in the distance, its voice carrying across the valley. The wind whispered through the grass, the same wind that had been blowing across this land long before they arrived and would continue long after they were gone. But for now, in this moment, they were here, together. And that was everything. As the years moved into the 1910s, the world beyond the ranch began to change in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming. There was talk of war in Europe, of new technologies that were transforming how people lived and worked. The Wild West that Delilah had arrived to in 1882 was fading, becoming something more civilized and structured. But the ranch remained a constant, a place where the rhythms of life continued largely unchanged. Cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, and the work was still hard but satisfying. Michael took on more responsibility as Xander began to slow down slightly, though he remained active and involved in all major decisions. Delilah, now in her 50s, found her role shifting as well. She was less involved in the daily physical work of maintaining the house, with Catherine and eventually Sarah's help when she visited, but she remained the heart of the family. She was the one everyone came to with problems, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, the one who kept the family connected and united. In 1918, as the World War finally ended and the nation celebrated, the ranch celebrated too. They had been fortunate to escape the worst of the war's impact, though they had contributed what they could to the war effort and had worried constantly about friends and neighbors who had sons fighting overseas. The armistice brought relief and hope for the future. That Christmas was particularly special, with the whole family gathered once again. Delilah looked around at the crowd of people filling her home and marveled at how one cold October day in 1882 had led to all of this. 36 years of marriage, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and counting. A legacy that extended far beyond the land and cattle to include the love and connections that bound them all together. Xander, now gray-haired but still handsome to her eyes, caught her looking and crossed the room to stand beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Everything," Delilah said. "How we started and where we are now. How one decision changed everything." "The best decision," Xander said, as he had said so many times over the years. "The best decision," Delilah agreed. They stood together, watching their family celebrate, and Delilah felt a profound sense of peace. This was what she had been meant to find, not ease or luxury or a life free from struggle, but this, a partner who had become her dearest friend, children who had grown into remarkable adults, grandchildren who represented hope for the future, and a home built on love and hard work and commitment. The arranged marriage that had begun so coldly had become the warmest, most fulfilling relationship of her life. The hard man she had feared had shown her gentleness beyond anything she could have imagined, and the life she had thought was ending in Denver had actually been just beginning. As the evening wore on, and the children were put to bed, and the adults settled in for conversation and music, Delilah found herself drawn outside for a moment of quiet. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the winter cold, looking out at the land that had become home. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival all those years ago. She heard the door open behind her and felt Xander's presence before he spoke. He draped a blanket around her shoulders and stood close, his warmth a comfort against the chill. "You will catch cold," he chided gently. "I just needed a moment," Delilah said, "to appreciate all of this." "It is worth appreciating," Xander agreed. "We built something good here, Delilah, something that will last. Because we built it together," she said. "That is what made it possible, not the arrangement or the transaction, but the choice we both made to try, to be patient with each other, to find love where we least expected it." Xander turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, she could see every line on his face, every mark that time and work had left. But she could also see the love in his eyes, as strong now as it had ever been. "I love you," he said simply. "After all these years, that is what matters. I love you, and you love me, and we built a life worth living." "I love you too," Delilah said, tears pricking her eyes. "More than I can ever say. You surprised me, Xander Irons, from the very beginning. You surprised me with your gentleness, your patience, your capacity to love, and you continue to surprise me every single day." He kissed her then, sweet and tender, a kiss that spoke of decades of intimacy and understanding. When they drew apart, both were smiling through their tears. "Come inside," Xander said. "Our family is waiting, and I want to dance with my wife." Delilah took his hand, letting him lead her back into the warmth and light of their home. Inside, someone had started playing the piano, and couples were beginning to dance. Xander pulled her into his arms, and they swayed together to the music, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world. As they danced, Delilah rested her head on Xander's shoulder and closed her eyes, committing this moment to memory, the feel of his arms around her, the sound of music and laughter, the warmth of home. This was what happiness felt like. This was what love built over years of patience and trust felt like. And when she opened her eyes and looked up at her husband's face, seeing the same contentment reflected there, she knew with absolute certainty that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. The arrangement had become a love story, the stranger had become her home, and the hard man had revealed himself to be the gentlest soul she had ever known. The music played on, and they continued to dance, celebrating not just Christmas or the end of the war, but the life they had built together from that cold October day in 1882 to this perfect moment in 1918. 36 years of marriage, of partnership, of love that had grown deeper and stronger with each passing season. And as the night deepened and the celebration continued, Delilah knew that whatever years remained to them, they would face them together, just as they had faced everything else. Together. Always together. That was the promise they had made all those years ago, standing awkwardly before Reverend Matthews. And it was the promise they had kept every single day since, through hardship and joy, through struggle and triumph, through the mundane dailiness of life, and the extraordinary moments that defined their journey. They had started as strangers bound by arrangement, two people brought together by necessity and desperation. They had become partners, friends, lovers, parents, grandparents. They had built not just a ranch, but a legacy of love that would extend far beyond their own lives. And it had all begun with a letter, a journey, and a man who surprised her with his gentleness. As the clock struck midnight and a new day began, Delilah and Xander kissed to the cheers of their family, and she knew that this was the happily ever after that had seemed impossible on that train journey so many years ago. Not perfect, because life was never perfect, but real and earned and infinitely precious. This was their story, the story of a woman bound by arrangement to a hard man, who discovered that the cowboy she married was gentle where it mattered most, in his heart, in his soul, in the way he loved her with everything he had. And that love had made all the difference.